know it was a bit of a late night for many of us, so it is great to see everybody here. Hello from sunny Philadelphia. I'm Meredith Weber. I'll be here with you today for our session, Understanding and Supporting Gender Diverse Students. We are incredibly lucky to have Dr. Todd Savage with us, former NASP president and the school psych trainer extraordinaire, joining us from Wisconsin. A few housekeeping notes. Please put your microphones on mute during the session, but if you do have a question, you can type it into the chat box and Dr. Savage will try to answer it for us. We're also going to leave a few minutes toward the end, around 10:15, to answer questions at that point too. Take a look at the chat box because there should be a link to the presentation there, and there may be other resources also posted there. So thank you so much, and I will let Dr. Savage take it away.
Thank you, Mary. Good morning, everybody. Welcome. I appreciate you being here this morning. I am an hour behind you, so I'm also a little blurry-eyed given the long night I had. It's my pleasure to be here, and I'm so thrilled to be part of the Pennsylvania's virtual convention, so thank you for that opportunity. As you heard, I am a school psych trainer at the University of Wisconsin, River Falls. I currently live in Minneapolis, St. Paul. River Falls is a border school. It's about 20 minutes from St. Paul. So I'm living in the area in which I grew up, and I have a 20-minute commute to work, which is really nice. So I was born and raised in the Twin Cities, and I'm a first-generation college student and was a fifth grade teacher that saw something in me that others didn't. I had a little bit of a rough childhood, and she took me under her wing, and the resiliency literature talks about all it takes for some kids to survive challenging situations is an important adult in their life. And for me, it was Mrs. Karen Altstedt, my fifth grade teacher, who got me going on a trajectory towards college and towards a better life. I originally went to the University of Minnesota as an undergrad to become a kindergarten teacher. And in 3 years of being in the program or at the U, I had no education credits, but a bunch of psych credits. So I just went out and finished a psych degree. And if you weren't aware of it, psychology is still the most popular major in the United States. And we hit the top of the pay and the glamour scale pretty quickly with a bachelor's degree. So I knew I needed or wanted to do something different, but I wasn't sure what it was. And I had a friend one day talk about, she was gonna go check out a school psych program, grad program, and asked if I would tag along with her. I'm like, well, what's school psych? I got through an entire undergraduate psych degree without ever hearing about the field of school psychology. So I tagged along to support her, and it's that old movie audition story. You know, somebody goes to audition for a movie and brings a buddy, and the buddy gets the part. I got into school psych, and my friend pursued a career in the culinary arts. So there you go. I did all my grad work at the University of Kentucky. I worked a little bit in Nebraska. I taught at Kentucky for a few years as an instructor. I was a faculty member at New Mexico State University for a few years and came back home to my home area now, where I've been back here for 13 years. Throughout my career, I have focused on culturally responsive practice, issues of social justice, school safety and crisis prevention, preparedness and intervention, and LGBTQ plus student issues, with an emphasis the last 6 or 7 years now around gender diversity, which is the topic that I'm going to be covering today. As you heard, I'm happy to address questions as they come up, and Mary's been very gracious to monitor the chat box. So if you do have a question, please feel free to post something there and I'll address it to the best of my ability. And then I also am going to set aside a few minutes at the end of the session to also address any questions that you might have. You should have access to the PowerPoint. It's in the chat box. I'm doing a couple of things with this presentation. Of course, I'm here to provide some professional development for you, but I'm also modeling how you might go about delivering this content if you are asked or expected to do this wherever you work. So I just, please don't feel like you have to reinvent the wheel if you put together a session. Feel free to pull from this presentation. Just as always, just ask that you give credit where credit is due. So I will again teach today, but I'm also going to model for you ways that you could go about delivering this content, and I'll try to distinguish between the two as I go throughout the session. Outside of work, I love to travel, I love music, I love to cook. And before I was in grad school, I was a professional dancer, but I'm 52 years old. That is 30 years in my past, but I do miss it. And I'm also a proud father of a sophomore in high school who dazzles his daddy and papa every day, and he is currently learning to drive. So there's extra stress going on here. That is a bit about me and my background. I neglected to share with you my pronouns. My pronouns are he, him, his. You see it on the PowerPoint. You see it on my Zoom name. And that's very intentional. For purposes of full disclosure, I do identify as a cisgender male. And if you're not familiar with that term, I will be going through that as we cover some of the content today. But again, I'm also modeling for you maybe some ways you can behave as a professional out in the field. I have my pronouns on my business card. I have my pronouns on my work name tag and my lanyard. I have it in my work email signature. And whenever I'm presenting or teaching, I also make sure that I put it on my PowerPoint presentations and that I state it at the outset of the session. So I just want to orient you towards that, and I'll talk more about that as we go through our time together. So that is and I should have, Mary mentioned that I am a past president of NASP. I had the great fortune to serve as the 47th president of NASP, 2015 to 2016, and it forever changed my career trajectory. It just impacted me in so many ways professionally, and I think I probably got more out of it than I offered. And it's really affected my teaching and how I supervise students and how I work with kiddos in the field. So I'm very grateful to have had that opportunity. All right, so let's start making our way through the content for today. So again, you see the title is Understanding and Supporting Gender Diverse Students. And just gotta make sure I can advance here. All right, so in terms of our journey for the next hour, hour and a half, I'm here to help increase your awareness around gender identity and gender diversity matters as they apply to schools. I'm here to hopefully either enhance your knowledge base or help you construct a knowledge base around this topic, and to leave you with some strategies that you could take away and apply tomorrow on the job. Now, I realize that we are time limited. You're getting highlights of a 3-hour workshop that I typically do. So I may not be going extensively into some of the strategies, but hopefully I'm giving you some ideas and whetting your appetite to seek out more. And I can certainly point in the direction of that as we go through our before our session is up today. As always, everything we do should be tied to the NASP practice model. And here's the brand new representation just released in July. And I believe this session aligns most closely with NASP domain number 8, which is equitable practices for diverse populations. All right, so this is where I'm going to do a little blend of teaching and modeling. All right, so I often co-present with the mother of a transgender son, and we've been in close to about 100 schools or 100 districts locally, regionally, and nationally doing this type of professional development for teachers, administrators, other school-employed mental health professionals, and so on. And we like to acknowledge the elephant in the room, that this is a topic that is sometimes uncomfortable for people. Perhaps it's something that they're vehemently against or something like that. And so we like to acknowledge this, that there's a range of experiences and viewpoints on this, and this is how I go about it. 88% of children in the United States attend public schools. And that means that close to 90% of educators, including people like us, school psychologists or future school psychologists, are attached to the public schools. And what do we know about public education, at least for the time being in 2020? It's that every child in this country is entitled to a free and appropriate public education, that everybody who shows up at that public school door must be welcomed in with open arms, and we have legal, moral, and ethical obligations to optimize every single child's potential for success, academically, socially, emotionally, behaviorally, and beyond. With that in mind, we are going to encounter children in families who are familiar to us. They appear to come back from backgrounds similar to our own. Perhaps they look like us, sound like us, things like that. And it feels kind of like a natural fit, and we just kind of go with the groove. We will also encounter students and families who are different from us in some way, shape, or form, maybe racially or ethnically, could be social class, It could be language, it could be religion, and for some, it could be sexual orientation, and it could be today's topic, gender diversity. Sometimes in those situations where we encounter difference or notice difference, it can make us uncomfortable, it can make us nervous, it can make us anxious, it can tap into our ignorance around issues, things like that. And we all have a starting point. So I want to acknowledge that, it's okay to be nervous or anxious or things like that. But we do have a responsibility to bridge the gap between where we're at and where we need to be to optimize that child's potential for success. The onus of responsibility falls on our shoulders. If I were to, we were live in person and I were to open up the floor and say, what drew you to the field of school psychology? Probably within the top 3 answers for everybody would be the fact that you love children. And that certainly was a draw for me. I have a passion for supporting children and helping shape their development and things like that. And so that was certainly a draw for me. But if I'm completely honest, there have been kids throughout my career that I haven't resonated with, or that I just flat out haven't liked for one reason or another. And I often blamed the kid for that dislike or whatever was going on for me. A group of kids for me that have been a trigger are kids with behavior problems. Now you're listening to me and you're looking at me cross-eyed thinking, wait a minute, you're a school psychologist by training. That's kind of our bread and butter. We're a go-to professional in the school to assist in those situations where a child might be experiencing some behavioral challenges or displaying some behavioral challenges. Yep. But I have to admit that behaviorism just has never been my philosophical orientation, not one that I typically resonate with. It's just not how I look at the world. I will concede that, the literature is replete with behaviorist principles that, when applied with fidelity and so on and so forth, have been shown to be very effective in working with kids who have those needs. But again, just because it wasn't how I looked at the world or how I, didn't resonate with me in graduate school, I just did what I needed to do to get through that course, or whenever it was addressed in subject matter, I just did what I needed to do and quickly moved on. So by the time I got to practice, I had little knowledge, few opportunities to practice, few supervision experiences. And my breaking point, or my epiphany, I should say, came in February of 2002 in Omaha, Nebraska, where one more kid with a behavior problem walked through my door. And the minute they left, I just broke down. And I don't know why I had the epiphany that day, but it hit me in the middle of my conversation with this child that this was a me issue and not a them issue. That this whole time, everything that was weak about me got triggered whenever I was confronted with a child with a behavioral challenge. It was, my lack of awareness, my lack of knowledge, my lack of experience. And instead of taking the responsibility for that, I blamed the kid and I couldn't wait for them to leave. Well, the realization hit me that day that this was a me issue and not a kid issue. And that I was the one that needed to shape up and do something here. Because if kids could do this, or kids didn't need the help, they wouldn't need us, right? The kids you dislike the most are the ones who need you the most. And the kids who need the most loving sometimes ask for it in the most unloving of ways. And we are the abstract thinking, educated, professional adults here. And the responsibility falls on our shoulders to find the way to work through that, the differences, or to bridge the gap, and to do what we can to the best of our abilities to optimize this child's potential for success. This topic might be that issue for some people. So I invite you, as we go through our time together, to just think about, be aware of what you're thinking, what you're feeling, what you're experiencing, and why, and to think about ways that you can bridge the gap if you notice that there is a gap between where you're at and where you may need to be to support gender diverse kiddos on the job. With that information in mind, I want to alert you that every major reputable professional, educationally related professional association in the United States has some position on this topic. Sometimes in these at these associations, gender diverse students are lumped under the larger LGBTQ umbrella, and so there might be a position statement targeting LGBTQ plus students. Some organizations have separated out a separate position statement targeting gender diverse kiddos specifically. Regardless of model, all inclusive under LGBTQ plus, or a separate standalone statement for gender diverse students, the same 3 themes come through each one of these position statements. That we, in whatever our role in education may be, must be supportive, and affirming of gender diverse kiddos, and do what we can to advocate for them on the job as issues arise. So on the screen right now, you see NEA's position, the National Education Association. I included two of the major principal professional associations and the links to their position statements in this regard. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't include NASPs. Now, these are not exhaustive statements by any means. The School Counselor Association, school nurses, school social workers, SLPs, OTs, PTs, and other educational associations all have similar statements with the same three themes: supportive, affirming, doing what we can to advocate on their behalf on the job. I like to highlight these position statements just to make you aware that as a NASP member or an APA member or someone attached to the field of school psychology, we have certain professional expectations coming down from on high about how we should behave in this regard. And it's also nice to remind our colleagues in the field that, you know, the professional associations they belong to that govern their work also have similar statements. It's more of a point of awareness that I point out when I go into schools to do this work. Before I start getting into some specific content, Mary, I don't know, is there anything in the chat box, or does anybody have any questions before I start making my way through some content? Not hearing any. I'm not going to actually have you engage in this think, pair, share, but for purposes of time. But I would like you to keep these prompts in the back of your mind as we go through the next set of slides, because the answers to these prompts will become illuminated there. Okay. So as you listen to the next set of slides, I'd like you to think about what's your understanding of what it means to identify as transgender or gender diverse. How is gender identity distinct from sexual orientation? And when do individuals become aware of their gender identity? The implications of all these prompts will become clear as I go through the content. So you're filing these prompts in the back of your mind. And here we go through some content. So I do like to start out with some definitions, and I don't mean to be patronizing. I'm assuming that most of you have at least a rudimentary knowledge base around this topic, if not actual experience with this in the field. But I do like to point out where the science and the literature are on this topic from a definition standpoint, and that we're all on the same page. We have a common understanding, as well as you. This is how I've set up the rest of my presentation based on this foundation. All right. So I do want to spend a few minutes going through these definitions. As I work my way through the definitions on this slide, I want to point out that there's going to be something very culturally bound about the way I present the definitions. And it's something that from a cultural perspective that is Western, quote unquote, Western in nature. The Western world being places like the United States, Europe, Australia, New Zealand. There's going to be something very culturally bound about the way I present the definitions. So listen in for how culture's coming through, and I'll stop partway through the slide and address the issue of culture. All right. So listen for how culture's coming through. So I'm going to start there at the top with sex. When I'm referring to sex here, I'm not talking about behaviors, but rather an assignment that's made to people by others based on biological data or information. So what does that mean? Well, pre-mid 20th century, prior to like 1960-ish or so, this was all done visually. So a baby was born. Of course, we made sure they were crying, their color looked good, their muscle tone looked good, you know, all the APGAR stuff. And then we immediately went south. And if we saw a vagina, we assigned female. And if we saw a penis, we assigned male. Now, there have been, and there continues to be infants born with other genital formats besides what we assume to be a penis or a vagina. In these instances, this belongs to a set of medical conditions known as intersex. And intersex is a whole nother workshop in and of itself. But just a quick brief lowdown, there are roughly 200 identified medical conditions that fall under the category of intersex. Sometimes this appears on the surface in the form of other genital formats. Sometimes the surface appears the way we'd expect it to look, but if we go below the surface of the skin, we find some markers that indicate that this person has an intersex condition. We can look at chromosomes, we can look at hormones, we can look at other markers that indicate that this person has an intersex condition. Some of these intersex conditions have cognitive or developmental sequelae. Many do not. There are some people walking around that have no idea that they have an intersex condition. They don't have anything on the surface, and they're not experiencing any cognitive or developmental issues that would indicate to somebody, we need to check something out here, okay? And you've probably heard of some of these conditions in grad school or perhaps on the job: Klinefelter syndrome, Turner syndrome, Williams syndrome, Rett syndrome. These are all forms of intersex conditions that also happen to have some cognitive or developmental sequelae that go with them, okay? And if you weren't aware, 1 in 2,000 births involves some form of intersex condition. It's much more common than many people realize, okay? So I wanted to acknowledge there is more than just male or female, but there's statistically, there have been 2 primary body forms throughout history: those with penises, those with vaginas, and this is where the terms male and female come in. All right, so we've assigned male or female based on what we see anatomically. There's another assignment that's made for that infant, and that's the assignment of gender. Now, where there's growing evidence in the literature that there may be some biological contributions to what we think of as gender, gender by and large is a social construction. You know, genitalia in and of themselves are meaningless. The terms male and female in and of themselves are meaningless. We make meaning out of that. And one way we do that is through the assignment of gender. We saw a vagina, we assigned female. This is what we've decided it means to be a girl or a woman in our culture, and we're going to start treating this person that way. Alternately, we saw a penis, we assigned male. This is what we've decided it means to be a boy or a man in our culture, and we're going to start treating this person that way, okay? So again, it's largely a social construction, decided, socially negotiated by a clan, a tribe, a nation, a culture, whatever, what it means to be a girl or a woman, or what it means to be a boy or a man. So sex and gender are assignments that are made to people by others. Gender identity is how we as individuals see ourselves in a gendered way. Gender expression is how we communicate our gender to the rest of the world. And in our society, we do this through things like appearance, such as how we wear our hair, what clothing options we choose, do we wear makeup or not, how do we use our voice, and maybe some of the gender roles we take on. So you see gender roles there. These follow from how we socially constructed the notion of gender. This is where the terms feminine and masculine come into play. So we've decided this is what it means to be a girl or a woman. These are feminine pursuits or feminine things. And there you go. And masculine pursuits are masculine things. And we've gendered everything in our culture historically. We gendered career pathways historically. Now it's 2020, there were more career options open to everybody. But if I were to open the floor and say historically, what career pathways were more open to women, I might hear things like teaching, nursing, things like that. And if I were to ask what career pathways historically were more open to men, I'd probably hear something like everything else. We gender color. In the 20th century in the West, somehow pink got associated with girls and blue got associated with boys. But did you realize prior to the 20th century, pink was actually a color assigned to boys in the West? Red historically has been, through centuries, been associated with men in the West. It's a sign of power, anger, things like that. And pink is a variation, it's a shade of red. And pink was often assigned to boys, or boys would wear pink clothes prior to the 20th century as a signifier of their gender. But somehow it flipped in the 20th century, especially in the United States. We've gendered emotions. We've got these emotion boxes. And we say, women, you have this set of emotions that you can express more openly, more freely. Men, you have this set of emotions that you can express more openly, more freely. And if people get too far outside of those emotion boxes, we get uncomfortable, and we find a way to try to get them back in to make ourselves more comfortable. So again, if I were to say, what emotions have we allowed women to express more openly, more freely in our culture, I'd probably hear things around like relational matters, love, sadness, more of a range of expressive type of emotions. And if I were to ask what emotions have we allowed men to express more openly, more freely, I might hear things like anger, stoicism, toughness, independence, things like that. Now, we're all human beings and we're all capable of the full range of human emotions, but every culture does shape emotion, expression of emotions, and it tends to be based on gender, okay? Now, this is where I want to pause before I address sexual orientation. This is where I want to pause and revisit that notion of culture that I primed you for at the beginning of the slide. So as you think about how culture came through and what is uniquely Western about this, again, in the interest of time, I'm just going to put it out there instead of ask for input here. If you think about how I presented the information, it was from a binary perspective primarily, by the gender binary, polar kind of things, man or woman, girl or boy. Now, I did address intersex a little bit, but that was just more from a sex assignment versus anything else. Well, while the gender binary might not be uniquely Western in and of itself, it is our strict adherence to the gender binary over the last 300 to 400 years that is. Throughout human history and to the present day, there have been and there continue to be some cultures where there's been space for gender identity beyond the binary. For example, prior to the European takeover of the North American continent, there were many Native American, American Indian, and First Nations Canadian tribes that recognized more than 2 gender identities. In fact, the research shows that some indigenous tribes of North America had up to 8 acceptable gender identities in their cultures, but it was the imposition of European cultural values that went away for some of those nations. Today, on the Indian subcontinent of Asia, countries like India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, there's this notion of a third sex, or what's termed hijra. If you look at indigenous Hawaiian culture, there's the mahu, which is the equivalent, some say, to a third sex. And we see other examples of this in indigenous Alaskan, Mexican, Central and South Americans, some South Pacific, some African, and some other Asian cultures. There has been and there continues to be space beyond the binary for people who identify elsewhere on the gender spectrum. And in fact, in the West, there is growing evidence. Historians are uncovering evidence in places like the Vatican archives and other historical documents that indicate that perhaps in Europe, there was recognition of gender diversity beyond the binary up until maybe 300 or 400 years ago. But for whatever reason, we got on this pathway towards the binary, we kind of got stuck there. So even though there's been increased visibility and awareness around gender diversity in the West in the last 25 to 30 years, it still feels pretty new to many people. And there are even some people saying we are culturally or politically or socially engineering something that just doesn't truly exist. And that simply is not the case. Gender diversity has always been a part of the human fabric. It just hasn't been recognized as such until the last 25 or 30 years or so, okay? With that in mind, I do want to address sexual orientation. The reason I bring sexual orientation into this conversation is many people confuse gender identity and sexual orientation. They are distinct, separate identity categories, but of course, as with everything else, they certainly overlap, intersect, and interface with one another. But sexual orientation has to do with one's primary psychological, social, emotional, and erotic attractions towards other people. It's the head and the heart stuff. Notice in that definition, there is no reference or mention of sexual behaviors. That is because sexual behaviors are not a defining marker or defining characteristic of sexual orientation. Your sexual behaviors may be an expression of your sexual orientation, or they may coincide with your sexual orientation, but they don't define it. It's the affectational aspect of this, to whom you're attracted in these ways. And your sexual behaviors may or may not follow. There are many people engaged in sexual behaviors that don't coincide with their sexual orientation, okay? Now, the reason I think some people may confuse gender identity and sexual orientation is perhaps where gender identity is housed. Gender identity is often lumped under the larger LGBTQ plus umbrella. And when many people think of that community, they go towards the sexual orientation aspect of it. So that may be one reason why some people confuse the two. Again, they are separate and compartmentalized identities, though of course they overlap, they intersect, and they interface with one another. One more slide of definitions and then we'll move on, but are there any questions that have come up in the meantime? I see a no, okay. So a few more definitions and then we'll move on. So cisgender, this is where I'm going to revisit that notion of cisgender I mentioned up front. Cis is a Latin prefix that means on the same side as, and someone who's cisgender, how they were assigned in terms of sex matches how they were assigned in terms of gender. And those assignments align with that person's gender identity, gender expression, and maybe some of the gender roles they take on. When all that lines up for a person, that person is termed cisgender. I'm going to assume that most people on the call today probably identify as cisgender just because statistically that's how it's playing out so far. All right. Now, transgender. I want to stress that I'm giving you an academic definition of transgender. If you are working with a student or you have a colleague or if you have a family member who identifies as transgender, I encourage you to seek clarification as to what that means for them, because they may use the term very differently from an academic perspective, okay? So from an academic perspective, transgender is tied to the binary. Somebody who's transgender from an academic perspective was assigned one way in terms of sex and gender, but in a binary system identifies as being the opposite. Now, that fits for some people, but it doesn't fit for everybody who's gender diverse. Now, and you've heard me reference gender diverse or gender diversity throughout our conversation so far. It is a more inclusive term pertaining to this topic we're addressing today. I want you to think about gender diversity. Gender identity is really an individual point on a spectrum of identities rather than a binary concept. Perhaps you've encountered students who identify as gender creative, gender expansive, gender variant, gender nonconforming, omnigender, pangender, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is an indication that gender really is an individual point on a spectrum of identities. The New York Times had an article on this topic about 5 years ago now. And in that article 5 years ago, they had roughly 90 gender identities that had been identified to that point. And it's probably only exploded in the last few years. So again, think about this as an individual point on a spectrum rather than the binary. It looks like there's a question.
Actually, it's from me, Todd, from Mary. So thank you. I do have a question. So the people I know who are transgender identify as like, I'm a trans man or a trans woman. I've never personally say like, I am transgender. But when I've seen sometimes demographic questionnaires, I've seen they'll say like male, female, or transgender. And I didn't know if that was right, just because like I said, I didn't know if anyone just says I'm transgender, and I was wondering.
Sure. I mean, I've encountered a few people who identify as transgender, but many people, and children and youth are leading the way on this, by the way, and we're going to talk more about that here in a little bit. But I'm hearing that term less and less, or it's kind of like gay. Trans might be a kind of generic overall term for a community, but people still have an individual identity that may or may not fit what people's conceptualization of transgender is. So really think about it as individual by individual. Some may use the trans term or not. And even if they use the trans term, it might be helpful for you to seek clarification about what that means for them. Now, we're focused on gender diversity today. I also want to stress that, how we look at sexual orientation is being reframed the exact same way. Historically, it's been heterosexual or gay or even bisexual, the midpoint. Sexual orientation it's becoming quite clear that too is really an individual point on a spectrum of sexual identities. So there's a parallel between the two identity pathways here. All right. So gender diversity, individual point on a spectrum of identities. Oh, so in terms of Mary's also observation about some forms or whatever you were referencing, might say male, female, or trans. We can't list all the potential options that apply. And so people are trying to find more acceptable terms or offering people the ability to put down what their identity is rather than check a box. So it might be moving forward best practice to offer an opportunity for everybody to write in their gender, their sex or their gender identity, just to make sure that we're being as inclusive and as sensitive as possible. But we're not quite there yet. And it looks like did something pop up in the chat box?
Sorry, I think it was about my micro not being loud enough in my question. I might need to fix my mic. So
okay.
About the category of transgender as like Dr. Savage said, after male and female questionnaire.
Sure. And before we leave this slide, just the signs that you're working with somebody who's truly gender diverse are this. that the messaging and the way they think about themselves from a gender perspective is consistent, persistent, and insistent. This is not the 3-year-old boy whose mom's putting on nail polish and he wants a little bit too, or a girl who prefers trucks over dolls. It's a consistent, persistent, and insistent way of thinking about oneself from a perspective of gender. Now, sometimes this is very apparent early on. And some kids are coming out and already socially transitioning before kindergarten. And there are people who come out later. And if you do a retroactive history with them or a retrospective history with them, you can see that this has been consistent, persistent, and insistent over time. It may have just taken them time to come to the realization or to the point where they're willing to declare their identity. Okay. Now, this notion of consistent, persistent, and insistent also applies to those of us on the call who identify as cisgender. But because of cisgender privilege, we probably never have had to think about ourselves in this way before. But if we really took a step back and just, sometimes people push back, how can a 3-year-old truly know, or an 8-year-old truly know, or a 12-year-old truly know they're gender diverse? And I like to turn the tables on them and say, well, how did you know at 3 or 8 or 12 what your gender identity is? And they look at you cross-eyed. They're like, well, that's all I know. It's just who I am. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Consistent, persistent, insistent. And it's the same with our gender diverse folks. It just stands out differently because of cisgender privilege. We live in a society that was set up by cisgender people for cisgender people. And for those who that fits, cisgender fits, they just entered a world that's set up for them and they just move through it without having to think about it. But for those elsewhere on the gender spectrum, it stands out perhaps differently, okay? Sometimes I've gotten pushback too, like, well, what about those who are gender fluid or gender variant, somewhere else in the spectrum where it is fluid or whatever. And does that consistent, persistent, insistent notion apply there? And I would argue, yes, they're still consistently, persistently, and insistently something other than exclusively cisgender. Okay. Any questions come up before we move on? All right. So when I go into schools and do this talk, I say, if you take nothing else away from today's talk, this slide should stick with you, okay? Now it is labeled transgender youth because that is what the original data set were labeled, was transgender. Now it is very possible that the participants in this original data set might've been all over the gender spectrum, but because of the way perhaps that the researchers asked the question or whatever, it was labeled transgender. So I just want to acknowledge that. Now you are getting the original data set here, but every research study that's come after this to confirm or disconfirm these data they have actually confirmed these data. So these data are pretty consistent, okay? So 80% of transgender identified adults report knowing their true gender identity before leaving elementary school or by the age of 10. Only 4% of gender diverse adults, or I should say transgender identified adults, report becoming aware of their true gender identity after the age of 18. So if you think about it, 96% of transgender adults were aware of their true gender identity before the age of 18 or before leaving high school. Well, what are the implications for those of us on the phone, folks? This happens on our watch. Now, this is awareness. This is not necessarily public declaration or coming out, okay? So, we service in the public schools kiddos ages 0 to 21. 96% of gender diverse adults were aware of their true gender identity before leaving high school. Okay, so when I've gone into schools to do this work, sometimes I get some pushback. Oh, we don't have any of those kids here. We don't need this. And I like to push back a little bit and say, I guarantee you have gender diverse kiddos taking up real estate in this building right now. You just may not be aware of it. So we have to behave and function as though there's always gender diversity, because there is always gender diversity, again, whether we know it or not. And if you really just want to be literal about it, and just think about it from a binary perspective, guess what? You got gender diversity in your school. But it goes way beyond the binary, okay? So again, we always have to think about this from a broad perspective and assume that it's always present whether we know it or not. Now you see here the average age of trans spectrum self-realization is just shy of 8, but again, it's a range. There are some kids who realize younger. There are kids who come to this awareness a little bit later, The one statistic on this slide that has changed is the fourth bullet, the average age of learning the words to communicate one's feeling. You see here it was 15 and a half, 8 years ago. That's already plummeted. Like I said, we've already got kids coming fully socially transitioned to kindergarten. This is what, those first 3 bullet points probably aren't going to change a whole lot with increased visibility, awareness, acceptance, and so on and so forth, because some of that's tied to Piaget. You didn't think you'd have to revisit your lifespan human development course, did you? Well, what did Piaget teach us about typically developing humans as thinkers? We're what type of thinkers up until approximately 6, 7, 8 years of age? Well, we know that kids tend to be more concrete in their thinking. The world's this way or that way. It is more binary, so to speak. They don't have the ability to think abstractly yet and to process all the other stuff. That's abstract thinking. And again, thanks to Piaget, abstract thinking creeps in for typically developing humans around 6, 7, 8 years of age and takes off from there. So for some students, why this awareness might come later is it takes metacognition. It takes the ability to think about thinking. It takes the ability to process one's true feelings to come to the realization as to what their identity truly is. Versus those who, I mentioned transgender, there are some people who, from an academic perspective, who do fit. They were assigned one way at birth, but identify as being the opposite in a binary system. And there are definitely some people for whom that fits. That persons in that situation might be able to come out earlier, have that awareness earlier, because it is kind of more binary in nature. It might fit concrete thinking. Again, and for others, it takes the ability to think abstractly, to process more accurately what their true identity is. Now, I will say here, there are some people who reference a study that came out of Europe, I want to say Sweden, maybe 15 years ago. And it's been shown to be complete bunk. It falls in the anti-vaccination research literature. We know that literature was the original, the one that got the whole anti-vaxxer movement going, has been shown to was falsified data. It's been shown to be complete bunk. This study that came out of Europe has been shown to be the same thing related to this topic. That study said that 80% of kids who came out as trans as early on did not ultimately identify that way as adults. And it was shown to be a flawed study, and some of the data I think were made up and so on and so forth. But maybe one nugget, and we don't like to take any nuggets away from bad literature, but maybe one nugget or takeaway from it is maybe what was going on is kids may have been coming out as trans early on, but as they got to be abstract thinkers and could process more accurately what their true feelings might have been, they may have actually taken an identity somewhere else on the gender spectrum and not on the binary perspective. Does that make sense? Okay. Last thing I want to cover in this slide is this notion of transitions. There are social transitions, and there may be, and I'm stressing maybe, medical transitions. Let me tackle each one of those briefly. Social transitions have to do with things like name change, pronoun change, maybe changes to appearance, how one wears their hair, what kind of clothes they wear, what kind of activities they engage in, things like that. All transitions pre-puberty are social only in nature. We are not doing any medical interventions on people roughly under the age of 9. I'm just 9-ish, okay? For those who wish to have a medical transition, and not everybody who is gender diverse wishes to have one, but for those who do wish to have a medical transition and they have the cash or the health insurance to get that medical transition, those types of transitions can kick in at pre-puberty and beyond. So we can introduce puberty blockers. And from there, we can introduce hormones that coincide with the person's identity. There are some surgeons who are doing what's known as chest reconstruction surgery or top surgery. It's not referred to as a double mastectomy in the community. When we think of double mastectomy, historically, with which gender have we associated that type of surgery? Well, historically, we've associated with women identified people. And these are not women identified people pursuing this type of surgery. So that's why it's been referred to as something like chest reconstruction or top surgery. There are some surgeons who will do that on adolescents. And for those who wish to have what's known as full sex confirmation or sex affirmation surgery, what people used to call a sex change, and I invite you not to use that term, it's not the accepted or appropriate term, but that's a term people have heard. It's called sex affirmation or sex confirmation surgery. There is no reputable surgeon in the United States doing that type of surgery on anybody under the age of 18. There are very strict medical guidelines that direct that kind of surgery. And one of the rules or one of the guidelines is you cannot do it on anybody under the age of 18, okay? So again, you heard me stress, not everybody who's gender diverse wants a medical transition. For those who do though, it takes cash or health insurance to do so. This is considered right now elective surgery in the United States. It's not considered medically necessary. And so many insurances won't cover it as being elective in nature. There are some insurance companies that do cover trans health, and they might cover some of these medical transitions, but many insurances do not cover trans health. So for those who don't have health insurance coverage or their coverage doesn't address this type of medical transition or medical issue, they have to have the cash to do it. And just to give you a flavor as to what this might cost, a friend of mine whose whose son started transitioning at age 11, went on puberty blockers, which was a once a month shot they had to be on for 4 years. Each shot cost $5,000. So $5,000 a shot times 12 months times 4 years, you do the math. Most of us don't have that kind of petty cash just sitting around that we can use for this type of transition. It's cost prohibitive for many people. And that was just the puberty blocker. This kid was also on hormones. He did have chest reconstruction surgery at age 16 and had full-on sex affirmation surgery at age 21. All of this was out of pocket. Now, this family was blessed with some means, but not everybody has those means. So again, for those who wish to have a medical transition, they have to have the cash or the health insurance to do so. So there's class privilege involved in some of this issue here. Any questions popping up? I'm not seeing any.
Not yet, but I did actually, oh wait, okay, here's a question. Can everyone hear me? Okay, this is from Alicia Fisher. It's a question about pronouns. Okay, it looks like one person can't hear me, but it may just be the computer. They are working with a non-binary student now and they have not given any guidance on what pronouns to use. I've asked a non-binary friend of mine what to do, and they said to ask, are there pronouns I shouldn't use? And when I ask the students, they say no. So when I'm writing the report, what is the most appropriate / sensitive way to make the student feel seen and heard, especially when parents are mixed on their acceptance? And in this case,
Sure.
is more open than dad is.
Well, I appreciate the question. I appreciate the fact that you you asked the youth themselves what pronouns to use. I mean, that is what we should be doing, is asking people themselves which pronouns do they use. In this case, it sounds like they provided no guidance in this regard. And I also appreciate that this person sought out advice of other people. In the absence of any specific pronouns being shared with you, it would be acceptable to revert to the plural pronouns. That has been an accepted convention. Now it may not fit everybody, but in the absence of specific pronouns being shared with you, it would be more sensitive or the convention would be to revert to plural. And for the grammarians out there, the Webster, Merriam people, the Oxford people, the language police, the ones who control the dictionaries and all of that, came out a couple years ago and said it is perfectly acceptable to use the plural when referring to the singular. So it is now acceptable from a grammatical perspective. I know that goes against some of our grains. I'm 52 years old. I came up, very strict grammar, and, it took me a while to convert to he, she instead of just he. We were just reverting to the masculine all the time. So I get it's kind of hard for some people to use plural when referring to the singular, but that is perfectly acceptable to do so. But I appreciate, first and foremost, we should be asking the person themselves what pronouns we should use. And when we don't know or they don't share, it'd be okay to use plural. Did a few more questions pop up? Okay. All right, well, this slide, gender diversity and autism spectrum disorder. Since the early 2000s, there's been growing anecdotal reports in the medical literature about a higher than expected rate of gender diversity amongst persons on the autism spectrum. So you see the middle bullet there, children and adolescents on the autism spectrum are 7 times more likely to identify as gender diverse. And the bottom bullet, children and adolescents appearing at gender clinics or clinics that specialize in trans health are 6 to 15 times more likely than their same age peers to have autism spectrum disorder. That's the best I can give you on this subject. There is research going on right now to determine, is there an association or correlation between autism spectrum disorder and gender diversity, but we don't know any answers yet. But but every time I'm in schools and this slide comes up, I can't tell you how many hands go up. It's like, oh my gosh, yes, we have seen this. So it is being recognized, but we don't know if there's an association or a correlation. We're just seeing higher than expected rates amongst persons on the spectrum. Now, anecdotally, I have a friend who's a child and adolescent psychiatrist who is a specialist in autism spectrum disorders, has been for 30 years. And she's now the go-to person in the Twin Cities for kids on the spectrum who also identify as gender diverse. Anecdotally, she said she has seen 2 different camps or 2 groups of kids who come in for this issue in her office. She's got a group of kids over here who, she has no doubt they're on the spectrum and she has no doubt they're gender diverse. Everything just fits and lines up and there you go. It's the other group of kids that she can't quite tease out if they're truly gender diverse or not. And I'm not trying to minimize people's declarations here. What she's wondered about this other group of kids is, this group of kids, these are kids who have often been socially ostracized or socially isolated. And a group of kids who have a group of peers who have taken them under their wings are LGBTQ plus identified. And she can't tell if the kids in this camp on the spectrum are saying they're gender diverse or LGBTQ identified because they're now part of a peer group and they want to be like their peer group and they're saying they're like their peer group, or are they truly LGBTQ plus identified? So again, one camp has absolutely no doubt, all lines up, all fits, yep. Other group of kids can't quite tease out what might be going on. But that's all anecdotal. I invite you to watch the medical literature and see what comes out here. I'm hoping within the next 5 years, we'll have at least more direction or more clarity. Some mental health issues to be aware of. So I'm sure you're all at least familiar with the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, have at least been exposed to it or had some education around it if you're not actively using it. So I need to give you a little history lesson, and I know you probably know this, but I just need to give you some perspective or context here. So the first DSM put out by the American Psychiatric Association, and it is primarily a United States source. Sometimes the UK will look to the DSM, sometimes Australia and New Zealand may look to the DSM, but the rest of the world really relies on the ICD, or the International Classification of Diseases, which includes medical, physical disease as well as mental disorders. But in the United States, we've separated out mental disorders into their own separate book, all right? So the DSM is uniquely US. So the first DSM was published in 1952. The second one came out in 1968. DSM-3 came out in 80. DSM-3R came out in 87. DSM-4 came out in 94. DSM-4-TR came out in 2000. And we're currently operating under DSM-5, which was released in May of 2013. Now, again, more context. Homosexuality. And I invite you never to use that term again. Don't refer to somebody as homosexual. Don't talk about this topic as being about homosexuality. It is unaccepted in the community. It was the pathologized, medicalized term in the DSM for something that, so until 1973, homosexuality was a diagnosable mental disorder in the DSM system, and it wasn't fully removed until 1994 with DSM-4. Between 1973 and 1994, somebody could be diagnosed with what was termed ego-dystonic homosexuality, but that completely went away with DSM-4. But homosexuality was the mental disorder. It was the pathologized, medicalized term for an identity. So there's that context. So how does it relate to what we're talking about today? Well, transsexualism first appeared in DSM-3. In DSM-4, which came out in 1994, it had morphed into gender identity disorder. And currently under DSM-5, it is now termed gender dysphoria. Now, people say there's a distinction between gender dysphoria and gender identity disorder, but persons in the gender diverse community will tell you, I don't care. It's still in the DSM. And just, this is me speaking, Todd Savage, opinion. Just as homosexuality never was and never should have been a mental disorder, I truly believe that gender identity doesn't have a place in the DSM system. Opinion. And persons in the gender diverse community will tell you they're not mentally ill just because of their gender identity. Their gender identity is not a mental illness. But here's the conundrum. For those persons who wish to have a medical transition and they have the cash or health insurance to get that medical transition, there's all sorts of guidelines and hoops they have to go through to get to the point where they're considered a candidate for medical transition. And the first step is you have to be labeled with gender dysphoria. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out in the rest of the world. ICD-11 put up by the World Health Organization, ICD-11 came out last year. In 2015, in anticipation of the release of ICD-11, the World Health Organization put out a statement that they would be removing gender identity or gender dysphoria, gender identity disorder from the ICD system. And it was, I believe, officially expunged from the system in May of this year. So now it doesn't, just because it's gone doesn't mean minds change overnight. There's got to be catch up, right? So I don't know how the rest of the world's handling this from a medical transition standpoint. If they don't have the label anymore, how do we go about that process? And I don't have an answer for you. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with DSM-6. Will it go away in DSM-6? Follow the kind of the lead of the rest of the world? I don't know. We'll have to see, and what the implications would be for a medical transition after that. But just FYI on that. The literature is replete in terms of those on the gender spectrum having higher rates of depression and anxiety, lower levels of self-esteem, and higher rates of substance use abuse and risk-taking behaviors. And the bottom statistics there should really jump out at you, the suicide attempt rate. 41% of transgender or gender diverse adults report attempting suicide in their lifetime, versus 10 to 20% of the lesbian, gay, bisexual identified population, versus 3 to 5% of the general population that reports attempting suicide in its lifetime. The 3 to 5% statistics have been stable 50, 60 years. We expect roughly 3 to 5% of everyday people to attempt suicide in their lifetime. So you see with the lesbian, gay, bisexual population, or this, I should say sexually diverse population, that number doubles, almost triples, 10 to 20%. And when we revisit transgender and gender diverse adults, when we have almost half of an entire identity community reporting the attempting suicide in their lifetime, we have a mental health crisis on our hands. And I'm going to make a statement, and they sound a bit melodramatic, but I stand 100% behind it. When we get our work right on this topic in schools, it is essentially life-saving. Hopefully we can chip away at that 41% suicide attempt rate. And that statistic's been stable roughly 10 or plus years. So again, when we have almost half of an entire identity community attempting suicide in its lifetime, that's a big problem. And it's not because they're gender diverse. It's not the identity itself that's the problem. That's the issue, I should say. It's the social isolation, discrimination, bullying, casting out from families, losing jobs, losing housing. We got a crappy political and cultural climate right now around this issue. All those stressors and problems that impinge on a person who identifies this way are the contributing factors to what might lead some to attempt suicide. Okay. Comments, questions, needs for clarification about any of this information presented so far? All right. I'm going to present some school-specific data for you, and these are hot off the press, and I'll talk about more of that here in a second. So these data come from GLSEN, the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network. It is an advocacy and education rights and resource group that's been around for about 30, 40 years. This is where GSAs got their start, and we'll talk more about GSAs in a few minutes. They've been the ones that got them started, got resources out there, and continue to provide assistance in that regard. Well, since 1997, GLSEN has done a biannual study of LGBTQ plus identified youth to get the finger on the pulse of what their school experiences are. So they collect the data on the odd year, and they report them in the even year. So you see these data are from 2019. They were just released not even a month ago. So these are the latest data. And they look at two big areas in this survey. They look at school climate and they look at school policies, practices, and procedures. And I believe the most recent study, the 2019 data, was based off of 21,000 respondents who represent, a range of racial and ethnic identities, class identities, come from all throughout the country. It's a randomized sample, and it's considered to be a very sound, very reputable survey. So I'm going to give you the school climate data first. And, oh, my clock's going off, sorry. I'm giving you the school climate data first. And unless I state otherwise, the statistics are specific to the gender diverse kiddos who participated in the survey. If it applies to the larger group, I will let you know, okay? So 43% of gender diverse kiddos report feeling unsafe at school because of the school climate in this regard. 40% report avoiding gender-specific spaces at school because of the negative school climate. 77% of gender-diverse kiddos report avoiding extracurricular activities, and 72% report avoiding school functions because they feel unsafe or unwelcome in those spaces. 17% of the larger LGBTQ youth respondents to the survey indicated they changed schools because they felt unsafe or uncomfortable at school. 33% of the larger LGBTQ youth respondents report missing at least one entire day of school in the past month because of the negative school climate, and 9% missed 4 or more days in the past month. If you're familiar with the absenteeism data and the relation to the school to prison pipeline, about 30 plus years, the statistic has been stable that if a kid is missing at least 3 or more days of school per month, any kid, they're at a higher risk of being pushed up by 9th grade and entering that school to prison pipeline. So and now in the last 2 years, that threshold has dropped to 2 days per month. If a student is missing at least 2 days or more of school per month, they're at a higher risk of being pushed out by 9th grade and entering that school to prison pipeline. So you see here with these data, when we have 9% of our LGBTQ plus student population reporting they're missing 4 or more days of school in the past month, that puts them at a higher risk for being pushed out by 9th grade and possibly entering that school to prison pipeline. 92% of gender diverse kiddos report hearing negative gender expression remarks, general negative gender expression remarks, things like the B word, the C word, man up, don't be a pussy, stop crying, things like that. And 53% report hearing those remarks frequently at school, meaning at least 3 to 5 times per week. 87% report hearing negative trans-specific remarks at school, with 44% reporting them at least, hearing them frequently, meaning at least 3 to 5 times per week. Oh, I forgot something. Before I usually present the data, I make a statement. And then I say, well, listen to the data, and you're gonna wonder where my statement's coming from. Well, I need to give it to you now because we got some context coming up. The statement I typically share is this. People, and I stand 100% behind it, people under the age of 25 don't give a rat's butt about gender diversity. It is a non-issue. And if people under the age of 25 do have a problem with it, it's because adults in their lives have, oh shoot, I just gave it away. Oh, sorry. It's because adults in their lives have a problem with it. This is learned behavior, just as racism is and sexism and the other isms, okay? So, but in general, my statement is people under the age of 25 don't care about it. It's a non-issue, all right? So then you're thinking about these data and you're like scratching your head like, really? These data don't seem to bear that out. Well, I'll unpack the data here in the next slide. So 67% of kids report, the respondents in the survey report hearing negative gender expression remarks from the adults in the building, and they report hearing them often, meaning at least 3 to 5 times per week. 57% of gender diverse kiddos report being verbally harassed at school, 22% report being physically harassed at school, and 58% of the larger LGBTQ youth respondents to the survey report being sexually harassed at school. 50% report being electronically bullied because of their sexual orientation or gender identity, gender expression. 57% of the LGBTQ youth crowd do not report these incidents. One of the reasons being 61% who did report indicate school staff did nothing in response. All right, so this is where I would have stopped and unpacked the data. So my statement, people under the age of 25, this is a non-issue. And you listen to these data and you're like, really? Sounds like schools are kind of difficult places for gender diverse kiddos. And it can be for sure. And there's definitely bullying going on, and we need to get that under control. The research shows though that the number of bullies is relatively low, but their impact is big. And what I believe to be the culprit here, what is leading to this, why the climate is such an issue, is the adult complicity in the problem. So back here we saw 67% of kiddos report hearing negative gender expression remarks from the adults in the building. And when kids go to report, 61% who said they did report indicate school staff did nothing in response. This is really an adult problem that's reinforced for some kids. And so that's, yes, we need to get bullying under control and we need to do some work there, but we really need to do some professional development work with the adults. When I go into schools, I'm not really targeting kids. I've talked to kids before, and kids certainly need some education perhaps, and maybe some enhancement to their knowledge, but kids get this and it's a non-issue. It's the adults that really need the education and the change of paradigm. Mary, is there a question that came up in the chat box? No? Okay.
No, but I would just add to what you're saying. Just this week, my son reported, or a friend reported that the PE teacher at his school who's being, broadcast was overheard telling kids not to do push-ups like a girl.
Yeah.
And I think he's probably in his 60s. And I do think there's so much language that doesn't even strike people as problematic, because it may be just like kind of ingrained that.
Right.
But it certainly went noticed by the third graders.
Well, thank goodness it did. I mean, that yay for third graders. And, even if adults aren't trying to be intentionally sexist or transphobic or harmful, I mean, language matters, and it sets up a mindset, and it does need to be addressed. So whether this teacher or not was intentionally trying to be sexist, it was a sexist comment, and it reinforces gender stereotypes and makes for an unsafe climate for everybody, but particularly our women identified or girl identified and trans identified populations. But it's just as harmful to cisgender men because it gives them tacit permission to perpetuate that kind of thinking and talk. So it harms everybody, especially the intended targets. All right, this next set of data from the same study, these are the school policies, practices, and procedures portion of the study. So 59% of transgender, gender diverse kids report experiencing active anti-LGBTQ policies and practices in place at their schools. 17% of students in the survey report being prohibited from discussing or writing about LGBTQ plus topics in school assignments, and 16% were prohibited from doing so in extracurricular activities. 28% of gender diverse kiddos report being disciplined for public displays of affection that coincide with the school's code of conduct. So let's say in a school district, in the code of conduct, it's acceptable for boys and girls to walk down the hallway holding hands. 28% of gender diverse kiddos report being disciplined for the exact same level of PDA, and they believe that they're being called out just because of their gender identity, okay? 8% report being prevented from attending a school dance or function. 15% report being restricted from forming or promoting GSAs, or what we used to call gay-straight alliances. There's been a movement afoot in the last 5 to 6 years to reterm these or rebrand these something along the lines of gender and sexuality alliances. There was research indicating there were some gender diverse kiddos who didn't think they could or should participate in a GSA or that it applied to them. Because when you hear gay straight alliance, even though allies are welcome, when you hear gay straight alliance, many people think it's about sexual orientation issues only. And so that's why there's been a movement to rebrand them something along the lines of gender and sexuality alliances to make them more inclusive and to send the message that this is for everybody, not just a certain group. Now, the research shows us numerous things about the positive benefits of GSAs, and there's two biggies, two big positive benefits. For those who actively participate, the research has shown there's been an increase in self-esteem, people feel more socially connected, they're learning leadership development skills, networking skills, advocacy skills, and so on and so forth. But interestingly, there's also another area of the research that shows that there's another group of kids who don't participate for whatever reason. They're not out, it's unsafe, they're prohibited from participating by family or whatever. But just the mere presence of a GSA is all it takes some kids to navigate difficult situations. Knowing that there is safe space and are safe people can make a climate safer in general for a kid. And this is why, and the same thing applies to safe zone stickers and things like that. Again, they're important for those who seek out the person on the other side of that safe zone sticker, but it also sends a message to those who don't, for whatever reason, that there are safe people present in the building. And so that alone can help some kids navigate difficult situations. It's not adequate or, in and of itself, but it is something, all right? 23% report being prevented from using their declared name and or pronouns. And I invite you not to say preferred. Preferred implies choice. And people will tell you, this is not my preferred name or preferred pronoun. This is my name. These are my pronouns. It may be more acceptable to say declared, but we just don't need to qualify these things anymore. People's names, people's pronouns, they're not preferred, okay? 28% report being prevented from using restrooms, and 27% report being prevented from using locker rooms that align with their gender identities. 18% report being prevented from wearing clothes considered inappropriate, quote unquote, based on gender. 11% report being prevented from wearing clothes or items supporting LGBTQ issues. 10% were prevented or discouraged from participating in school sports because of their LGBTQ plus identity. And 3% of the students in the survey report being disciplined only for being LGBTQ plus identified. So there you go. The effects of a hostile school climate coming from the survey. Gender diverse kiddos are 3 times more likely to have missed school in the past month. They have lower GPAs than their non-harassed peers. They're twice as likely to report not pursuing post-secondary education. And while the folks on this call may not be primarily responsible for post-secondary planning, that sometimes falls to like a school counselor or somebody in that role. Where this does apply to us though on the phone is for those persons who are receiving special ed services prior to 9th grade. Well, special ed services, 9th grade, we have to start thinking about post-secondary planning, transition planning, okay? Who's ever doing post-secondary planning in your buildings, whether it's the traditional post-secondary planning, come down in 10th grade and learn about college, or us participating in a team doing some transition planning for kids with special education labels. If you're not familiar with the website campuspride.org, you need to become familiar with it. It rates 2- and 4-year post-secondary institutions in the United States on their LGBTQ plus inclusiveness, policies, supports, and so on. So if you have a kid that comes in with a short list of 10 schools and you pull up campuspride.org and 3 of these schools, it's like, oh my God, you're never gonna survive there. It just makes your post-secondary planning all that more meaningful. So even those of us on the call who are doing that post-secondary, that transition planning, with kids who are in special ed, again, it would be helpful for us if we have a LGBTQ plus identified kiddo to get a sense as to what they want to do after high school, and if it includes some type of technical college or traditional college or some core job development, it would be helpful for us to know where they're considering going, whether they're going to be safe and included there. And finally, gender diverse kiddos are twice as likely to have been disciplined at school than their cisgender peers. Some legal and policy matters that apply, and I'm not an attorney, but these are the ones that are often the go-to kind of legal and policy matters in terms of addressing this issue in public schools. First of all, at the top there, Title IX, first passed in 1972 and last reauthorized in 2002, now known as the Patsy Mink Equal Opportunity Education Act. I'm old enough that when Title IX was first passed, I was just entering school, and an image for older people, or I shouldn't say older, people of advanced generations, an image of a visible image of the outcome of Title IX was young women's participation in school sports. But what most people don't realize that Title IX has always been and continues to be about gender equity and gender parity and accessing, there's my alarm, 15 minutes, in accessing all levels of the educational process, academic, social, emotional, behavioral, developmental, extracurricular, athletics, and beyond. We're supposed to be guaranteeing gender equity, gender parity in all of those realms. Well, since 2002, when Title IX was last reauthorized, the US Department of Education Office of Civil Rights has officially recognized gender identity and gender expression as protected classes under Title IX. And the US Department of the Office of Civil Rights and the US Department of Justice have filed and won numerous lawsuits in this regard. There's numerous case law cases supporting the recognition of gender identity and gender expression. I'm going to give you an example, and I'm going to frame them first, though. I'm going to say bathroom lawsuits, because that's a term most people have heard. This is why every single bathroom lawsuit as of a month or so ago brought forward by a public school denying access to facilities to gender diverse kiddos has been lost by those school districts. It goes back to Title IX. Now, I said bathroom lawsuits because that's what people have heard. Just as it never was about water fountains or seats on a bus, this issue is not about accessing facilities. It's a civil rights issue, and these are civil rights lawsuits, okay? FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, it is legally allowable under FERPA for students ages 18 and above and or their parents or legal guardians at any point in the educational process to request name and gender marker changes on all legal school paperwork. Now, FERPA doesn't say what's required to do so beyond the request to have it done, but some districts, as they go to deal with this, have said, oh, okay, we'll do that, but we need a modified birth certificate. Well, what's the social justice issue with that? What's it take to get a modified birth certificate? Cash, lawyers, time off work, transportation. And for persons where those are issues, they don't have access to those or limited access to those types of things, they're not going to get a modified birth certificate, or it's going to be much more difficult to do so. Again, FERPA doesn't require a modified birth certificate. It just says it's legally allowable. So I just encourage you, as your districts continue to grapple with this issue, if they're requiring some type of forms like that, that you folks have conversations and try to find a more equitable or more just. I don't know if there's a perfect solution, but if we can find a more just or more perfect solution to making these changes that doesn't, minimizes the impact of class privilege and things like that. I just want you to have that awareness. One law that's not up here, but I should mention, is the Equal Access Act of 1984, passed under the Reagan administration. It came about, there were many public schools in the late 70s, early 80s grappling. There were people trying to form religiously focused or themed extracurricular clubs, but often were met with, we can't because of the separation of church and state. Well, the Equal Access Act allowed the formation of those clubs with certain provisos. You have to obey all the rules that govern extracurricular clubs. You can't proselytize, you can't, these can't meet during the school day, you have to have a faculty advisor, so on and so forth. Well, so this is why Fellowship of Christian Athletes can, function in some schools and things like that. Well, what they didn't anticipate with this law is this is the exact same law that allows GSAs to function. So we can't prohibit GSAs in public schools under the Equal Access Act. We have to allow for the formation of them. Mary, it looks like you have a question.
Yes, and I'm so glad someone asked this because I think it's on a lot of people's minds. What is the guidance? This is from Christina. When a student requests a name change, but a parent is against it,
Sure.
writing evaluation reports for a minor age child.
Yeah, so it's a complicated matter. I want to acknowledge that, and I don't have a cookbook answer for you. But general guidance, public schools, many school boards or districts are passing policies where they will support gender diverse kiddos despite lack of parent support. Now, I want to make sure you hear loudly and clearly, and we are being recorded. We need to partner with families first and foremost. Our standard operating procedure shouldn't be going around families. So doing everything we can to work with families in this regard, to provide resources, to help educate them, to help support them. And in those cases where it's just not gonna come through. And a district has a policy where they will still support a gender diverse kiddo despite lack of parent support. They'll use the child's name and pronouns. They'll allow the child to present how they wish to present at school and things like that. It's possible, okay? How do you handle that in reports? I mean, I guess, again, if the school has a policy in place and you can back yourself up with the policy, it might make it easier to, use pronouns and names and other things in those reports that reflect the child's identity. In those situations where there aren't policies in place or you don't have backing of the school district's legal counsel, it's going to be more challenging. So again, I don't have a definitive cookbook answer, but hopefully you're hearing some nuggets there that are takeaways. In terms of I'm sorry, was there another question, Mary?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, well, thank you for the last answer. This is from Rebecca. I work in a rural school district in central Pennsylvania. It is highly probable that gender diversity is a non-issue to most of the adults with administrative power in our district. Most counselors in our district, several teachers, and at least me as one of a few school psychologists, know gender diversity is present in our schools and district and need to be supported. You mentioned having a safe zone sticker on an office door as a visual to students that the adult in the office or classroom is safe. What are some other visual identifiers or resources I can review or use that will address my current school climate, and I can start an education campaign, and that I can use to start an education campaign for the adults in my building, which is a junior high, and to let students know that there are adults in their school setting that will support students and advocate for gender diversity?
So sure. So beyond some of the, presence of a GSA or safe zone stickers, and I invite you with safe zone stickers, and if you have representations of LGBTQ plus the flag, the rainbow flag, they've been redesigned. And I invite you to get the more inclusive or the most recent one. So I'll see if I can find one quick. The reason I say that is they've been redesigned. Here it is. They've been redesigned to include transgender. So, the traditional flag was just the rainbow, but brown and black have been added to reflect the racial diversity within the community. And then the white, pink, and blue, those are the colors of the gender diverse community, the trans community. So I just invite you that as you're using safe zone stickers, I'm sorry, did you see that? You didn't see that, did you? Could you see the flag that I pulled up?
No, I think you have to share your screen.
Yeah, I had to share my screen. Duh, sorry about that. Come on. All right, sorry. All right, so share screen. This one, okay, sorry. So here's the most recent version of the flag. So you see here, this is the traditional rainbow flag, but black and brown have been added to reflect the racial diversity. And then white, pink, and blue again is the colors of the gender diverse or trans community. So I guess I invite you to, if you have safe zone stickers or you display the flag or whatever, that you use this flag or this safe zone sticker that includes this, because it is much more inclusive and it sends the message to your gender diverse kiddos that you get it. Again, if you just have the rainbow flag, nothing necessarily wrong with that, but it is exclusive. And so just materials that reflect that. But then beyond that, things like access to literature, books in the library, access to websites. Sometimes all LGBTQ oriented websites are blocked at schools, but there are some very appropriate ones that could be accessible. Some students might only access information at school. They don't have internet at home. They don't have reliable internet. They don't have devices. It may not be safe to look up these topics at home. So, LGBT themed literature, and there's pre-K through 12 literature on this topic, having access to that in the library at school, bringing it into classrooms, artwork that displays a variety of people from a variety of backgrounds. And it doesn't have to be boys and girls holding hands or anything like that. I mean, developmentally appropriate, just showing a range of identities. So I think all those types of things help communicate what the community's values are and send signals that we are an inclusive community and we're going to support all students and things like that. Now, it talked about a range of materials like books and things. So there's a children's book called Read a Crayon Story. It is not about gender diversity specifically, but it has been used to highlight the notion. If you're not familiar with the book, it is a blue crayon in a red wrapper. And everybody sees the red wrapper and assumes it's a red crayon, but the crayon color's blue. And it's been used as a parallel for a number of identity issues. And it's been used to highlight this notion of gender diversity. But there are other specific gender diverse themed books at the elementary, middle, and high school level that are very appropriate to have on library shelves and in classrooms and things like that. When you identify your pronouns as an adult in the building, when you use inclusive language. I'm a public speaker. I used to, get up and do the traditional, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for having me here, blah, 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 blah. But when I do that, I've excluded members of my audience. And so when I've gone into schools and coached teachers and others to think about language, at the universal level, use inclusive language. So I might say, instead of saying, good morning, boys and girls, I might encourage a teacher to say, good morning, first grade scholars. It's time for a literacy circle. Grab your carpet squares and come up front. Now, it doesn't mean gender goes away. We still honor every individual kiddo in that room for their name, their pronoun, things like that. So it's just at the universal level, we're more inclusive in our language. And again, maybe we use the plural pronouns at the universal level just to be more inclusive. But again, when we work with individuals, use the pronouns that fit them. So those, I think, are all signals and strategies, quite frankly, that could be used. I realize our time's almost up. I want to go ahead.
It looks like we have one more question. Also, I'm gonna just put the name of that book here. Okay. So this question is from Gail. What is your opinion about a 4-year-old child identified male at birth, but preferred female type clothing and dolls to play with, that was allowed to change her name to a typically female name before kindergarten?
Well, there's 2 video links in the PowerPoint. I knew I wasn't going to get to them because of time, but I wanted you to have them beyond the workshop. And one was called Raising Ryland, and it shows a child who fully socially transitioned before entering kindergarten. Whether or not, now I would argue, if somebody comes out that age, they probably know something we don't. And we got to trust their lead on this. Even if they're not, or it doesn't play out long term, what is childhood about? It's about play, and it's about trying adult roles. What is the problem with allowing a kid to put on clothing? I mean, why do we have gendered clothing to begin with? But because we do. What issue do we have with a child putting on clothing that doesn't match their assigned, gender or whatever, or that they play? I mean, why do we have gendered toys? I'm a cisgender identified male, but as a kid, I always preferred dolls, doll houses, things like that. It wasn't because I was a girl. You don't have to be a girl to like those things, and you don't have to be a boy to like other certain things. Again, this speaks to just how binary we've been and how stuck we've been. We just provide access to whatever's available in this classroom and let kids gravitate towards what resonates with them and have at it. It's adults that have the problem. Why does this make me uncomfortable that this kid's wearing that outfit or uses that name? You know what? We allow nicknames all the time. My partner's name is William. He's never gone by William. He's only been known as Bill throughout his entire life. And you know what? Schools accommodated that and had no problem that his record said William, but he went by Bill in the classroom. What issue do we have if somebody's record says this, but they want to go by this name in the classroom? Why are we so uptight with it? And I'm not criticizing anybody in this call. I'm talking in general. So it's, adult issues. We got to get out of our own comfort zones and our own limited thinking and just provide opportunities for kids to play and to express themselves within appropriate boundaries. It's not like just have at it. We sexual expression and things like that, not appropriate in a 4-year-old, but we find developmentally appropriate ways to allow children to express themselves. Not that we should squash sexual expression. We should figure out what's going on and why a child might be expressing themselves that way and if they've been abused. But in general, it's just not socially appropriate, period, in public spaces. So again, developmentally appropriate ways to allow kids to just play with the world, express themselves, and find things out. So I do want to just leave you with one piece of school psych specific wisdom, and then I know our time's up. When it comes to assessment and gender norms, you're not going to find a lick of this in the school psych literature or the cognitive assessment literature. So I need to put that up there full disclosure. But the guidance is, or the wisdom is, that when you're working with a gender diverse kiddo, you should use the gender norms that coincide with the person's identity. Now, if you have a person elsewhere on the gender spectrum, they're not boy or girl, and they're not trans, they're elsewhere on the gender spectrum, the wisdom would be use the combined norms. But in those measures where you don't have combined norms, you may have to make a decision about, should I even use this measure, or do I have to report the results with caution, or do I not even report the results because they're not valid? In those situations where you're working with somebody where you have access to gender norms, the reason you should, why the wisdom is you should use the norms that coincide with the person's identity, it comes from the gender cognition literature. There's a whole area of the literature called gender cognition, and it's looking at gender diversity and how people think from a gendered perspective. And what the gender cognition literature has revealed to us is that on measures of gender, transgender males endorse the exact same gender profiles as their cisgender male counterparts, and vice versa. Transgender women endorse the exact same gender profiles as their cisgender female counterparts. They quote unquote think like the gender they associate with. And so that's the literature that's been used to support this notion that you should use the gender norms that coincide with the person's gender identity versus how they were assigned at birth. And again, in those cases where you don't know, or you have persons elsewhere on the gender spectrum, combined norms are the best way to go. All right, so I just wanted to throw that out there. Now, I'm telling you this, but you need to have conversations at the local level or even at the state level about how you want to handle that. But I just wanted to put that bug in your ear before our time was up. I'm a couple minutes over. I really, really thank you for your time and attention to your questions. Is there anything last minute before we stop? Well, again, thank you for this opportunity. I wish you all well. Thank you for all you do for kids, period. Thanks for all you're doing under these extraordinary circumstances we're living. And thank you for all you're doing for gender diverse kiddos.
Thank you so much. And I hope you get a minute to read the chat box comments because, this was great and we really appreciated it.
And I can always follow up with individual questions about other strategies, but you have access to the information. Thank you, everybody.